Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 7 of Chess Basics, things every chess player ought to know. Today we are going to look at the main line of the Ruy Lopez. Last week we looked at some of the interesting options that occur in the open Ruy Lopez, and the main line though is the closed Ruy Lopez, and that's what we'll look at now. So the Ruy Lopez is this position. Let's back up and show how we got here. It's a e4, e5 opening, both players trying to place a pawn in the center. White attacks the center pawn and black defends it. Knight f3, knight c6, and then white plays bishop b5. So this is the Ruy Lopez. And the main line continues with the Morphy defense, a6. And I may talk briefly about some other lines later, but in this episode we're just doing the main line. And the exchange variation, bishop takes knight, is playable, but you can't actually win a pawn, as we saw earlier. But it is a way to play. But the main line, bishop retreats, and then black attacks white's center pawn here. And white does this unusual move of castling, not even bothering to defend that pawn. And the open Ruy Lopez is when black takes that pawn, and we looked at all the complications that ensue after that. In this case, though, the main line is not to take it, although we saw that is playable. But white doesn't need to fear that, and black can play that. So I was just double checking. The main line, as you can see it here, so knight takes e4 is a second choice. The main line is bishop e7. And that's what we're going to look at. Bishop e7. So now at this point, black really is threatening to take that pawn, because most of the counterplay for white after black grabs the pawn, and the way he tries to get it back is by exploiting this pin along here by playing rook e1 and along the e file. But this bishop being in the way means that there's no pin here anymore, really. There's too many pieces in the way to have an effective pin. So white needs to do something about this pawn, and the reason he played this way, I mean, he could have just played d3 on the previous move. And let's see if I can erase this arrow. Yeah, that one's gone. He could have just played d3 on the previous move and defended it, but the idea and the reason white is playing like this is because he wants to play his rook to the center file and defend the pawn this way, and later try to get in d2 to d4 in a single move without going through d3. So the normal response, now that white has defended this pawn, he's also threatening to win a pawn here. Now if bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes pawn, this actually will hold on to a pawn. So black needs to react to this, and black usually plays b5, driving the bishop back to b3. Okay, so now finally both pawns are defended, and there's none of that funny stuff going on. It's black's turn to move, and there's two different ways he can play it here. He can castle, which leads to the Marshall Gambit, and I'm not going to talk about that one. Or he can simply play d6. This defends this center pawn a second time and opens up an avenue for the bishop, which could come out here and pin this knight. Or it could come over here to, these are the two ways the bishop might develop. It might develop over here to b7, or it might come out to g4. Now another place it might come out to is just to e6 there. That's a post it might take and trying to pose this bishop. So these are different ways to play. But it's white's turn to move here. And white is following up his plan of trying to conquer the center. He's got a rook supporting this pawn. He plays c3 with the idea of playing d4, d5 in a single move. The normal move for black here is to castle, get out of the center and head of the action. And white at this point wants to stop this idea of bishop g4 pinning the knight, because he needs this knight to defend the center when he plays d4. So the normal move for white here is h3. And now this is one of the main branching points in the Ruy Lopez, the closed Ruy Lopez. And I'm going to just leave it off here. This is a position, again, that both sides can play, and let's just talk about some of the ideas here. So one idea for black is to play this knight out of the way to this square where it attacks the bishop. The bishop might retreat back here, which is a secondary benefit of c3, as it allows the bishop a nice little hole on c2 to hide from that knight. And the second idea of that knight move is to allow black to play c7 to c5. So that's one way to play. Let's erase those lines. Second way for black to play is, that's called the Chigorin defense, by the way. This Breyer defense is the knight goes back here, which seems like a really strange move. But the idea, once again, is to get out of the way of the c-pawn, and also to develop the knight to this square, which may be a better square. The knight's a little more secure there. And interesting way to play. That's the Breyer defense. And yet a third idea for black is to move his rook over here and move his bishop to that square. So rearranging the pieces, again, getting more support in the center. And the bishop over here is actually a good defender of this square, and it's also out of the way of the rook. So that's another way to play. The only funny thing about this one is that immediately after the rook comes here, white could play his knight to this square and double attack this pawn, and then the rook would have no better move than to go back. So sometimes that can be used to obtain a short draw, but usually white doesn't want to draw, so typically black is safe in playing this way. If white decides to go for the drawing line, then black will have to come up with another way of playing, maybe doing one of the knight moves we talked about. But that doesn't happen that often. Okay, let's get rid of those lines. And those are the plans for black. And what are the plans for white? Well, one of the main ideas, as I said, is to move this pawn up to here. And another interesting idea you often see in this is the knight, after that pawn comes up, the knight goes to this square, d2, then to f1, and then up here to either g3 or e3. So this neat knight maneuver is made possible by getting this pawn out of the way. The one thing you have to be careful about is after you push your pawn to d4, you have to always be guarding against this take. And when the knight is here on d2, it's blocking the defense from the queen. So you always have to be careful playing these moves that you don't leave a piece undefended. Another common tactic in these positions is black gets his rook on e8, and then after an exchange of this pawn and with the bishop out of the way, he's putting more pressure on the e-pawn, so sometimes this guy can turn out to be undefended. White's bishop often comes back here, and in any case, this is the main position of the Ruy Lopez closed variation, and it's a line that both sides can play, and I recommend playing around with it. And also, if you're adventurous, you can try some of those lines in the open variation. That's all I'm going to talk about in this episode. Next episode, I'm going to talk about a new way of playing the Ruy Lopez that's come into fashion recently. It has some claim to being the new main line. And maybe I'll talk about some of the other sidelines. I'm not going to go into great detail in the Ruy Lopez. This is just a Chess Basics series. You can look at lots of games. This is still played at the top levels. So looking at master games is a great way to find about ways that people are playing this currently. But after I do these 4 episodes on the Ruy Lopez, I'm going to turn to a different topic. So that'll be it for this series. So I'll see you next time. We'll talk about the so-called new main line of the Ruy Lopez, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Bye.